Good afternoon. Let me invite you to take your places and let me offer a word of welcome. I'm Gerald Winslow. I'm the director of the Center for Christian Bioethics that hosts our occasion today. If you have a growing interest in the academic study of ethics, we'd love to have you come talk with us. We have a lot of services from the center that you might be interested in. One of those is going to be this Saturday afternoon at 3 o'clock. Maybe you've seen these posters. This is going to be an interesting program with 3 different perspectives on prenatal genetic diagnosis, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, if you know that language. Complicated subject. I'm looking forward to it. The chairperson of the Advisory Council for the Center for Christian Bioethics, Karen LeBack's one of the nation's leading ethicists, especially related to healthcare, is going to be present. And the Germans have the notion of Dr. Vater, they say the father of your doctorate. She is my Dr. Mother because she was my advisor for my PhD in Berkeley. And so come and join us for that occasion, if you will. Very pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Scott Allen. He is an Emeritus Professor of Medicine at the University of California, Riverside, where he's also been chair of the Department of Medicine and Associate Dean for Academic Affairs. Right now, Dr. Allen is serving as a physician and medical director at the Access Clinic, which is part of Borrego Health, a system of federally qualified health centers. Most of you understand that language. He earned his medical degree at Brown University, and later, in conjunction with his work at Brown, he co-founded the Center for Prisoner Health and Human Rights, which goes on today, to this very day, and for which he still holds the title of one of the co-directors. As a 10-year-old burn patient, Dr. Allen was affected by the suffering of other children around him, and at the age of 17, responding to a news report about starvation in Cambodia and on the Thai border, he quit high school, and he went to Thailand and then worked in the refugee camps. A very formative time in his years as he worked there for 5 years. After he returned to the U.S. and completed his medical studies and residency, he served with the National Health Service Corps in community health centers in Mississippi, in the Delta, and also in Rhode Island. I won't be able to tell you all of his fascinating story that I have here in front of me, but other noteworthy elements here. He uncovered medical participation in a U.S. torture program and co-authored a number of reports for the United States on the United States interrogation program. He, inspired by the unmet needs of his own developmentally disabled son, he and his wife co-founded the Access Clinic, which is a novel approach to primary care for adults with developmental delays or disabilities. So he's also now currently a medical consultant with the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties in the Department of Homeland Security for the United States government, monitoring medical care in immigration detention facilities. And I don't know if you've turned on the news in the last couple of years, but if you have, you might recognize this as an important topic to discuss. And you might understand why we were eager to have Dr. Allen come and talk with us. Among his many other accomplishments, he was recognized for his efforts in human rights as a co-recipient of the 2019 Reidenauer Prize for Physicians it's called the Physicians for Human Rights Award. And so I hope you feel as pleased and eager to hear Dr. Allen as I am. Would you please welcome him to Loma Linda?
Thank you. Yes, I do. That was very kind of you. So first, thank you for having me here today. It's a great honor to be here. I do live and practice right down the street. I'm part of your same community and came here 9 years ago to help co-found the clinical program at the UCR New School of Medicine. And as I've shared, Dr. Larry Liu is a good friend of mine and colleague who, of course, works and has worked in both programs. We've had conversations over the years that one of the things that impressed me as an outsider coming to this community, which is largely and densely populated by doctors who did their training through the Loma Linda system, is I feel in my whole career I've rarely been surrounded by so many physicians who had a profound sense of mission and values that I felt were compatible to what I think are important in the profession. So we've talked about it. I think there's something that's very right about how you are being trained and developed in this program. And so when I was invited to contribute in some small way, it was a great honor. So that's my disclosure about how delighted I am to be invited to speak here today. You've already heard the other disclosure, but we should formally acknowledge it, that I'm a paid subject matter expert for the Department of Homeland Security Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. But as I tell my story, you will also realize that the opinions expressed today do not represent the position of the department or the U.S. government, and of course quite the contrary. Now, we're having this conversation today in the context of an ethics program. I'm surrounded by people who study and are experts in ethics. My contribution is not as an expert in ethics. My contribution, if there is one to make, is of someone who has practiced medicine in ethically challenged environments my whole career. And having confronted ethical conflicts and struggled with them, that's where my interest in ethics came about. When I was, if you're a student still wondering how relevant this all is, you can be forgiven. It's once you cut your teeth against a tough ethical situation that you start to realize that having a good framework for negotiating that difficult situation is enormously helpful to you. And I hope if you leave today with nothing more than a better understanding of that, we'll be in good shape. Now, the Department of Homeland Security and the office I work in, the office, that little box there on the right, but if you look at the way the organizational chart is made to fit on the traditional slide, it's actually everything on there is co-equal, which is to say the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties is a headquarters function. It's co-equal with offices such as the Office of Inspector General or the Office of General Counsel. So it's pretty high up. It's a pretty powerful unit, so that when we arrive to inspect facilities, we're not easily dismissed. We have really full access to everything going on there, and basically anything we ask for we will get, anything we want to see we will get, and anyone we want to talk to we will get. So I just bring that up to set the stage that the work I do for Homeland Security allowed my colleague Dr. McPherson, who I'll refer to, who's a psychiatrist, and myself to gain a rather unique perspective on what's really going on in family detention facilities. This is a job we were recruited to do in 2014, so it's been 5 years that I've been serving in this role. The basic job description is to evaluate family detention facilities by the standards that the department has set for these facilities, and they include external standards like the National Commission on Correctional Health Care, which is jail and prison standards by an organization that is modeled after the Joint Commission. It'd be like the Joint Commission is for hospitals and clinics, the National Commission is for detention facilities. The family residential standards and the performance-based national detention standards are the standards that Homeland Security set for itself. Now, the reason I mention this is it's sort of a cut and dry job. We go in and say, are you meeting your own standards? One of the first problems that Pam, I'll refer to her as Dr. McPherson, my colleague, Pam and I noticed when we entered the facilities is these standards aren't particularly very strong. And so that's one of the first issues we raised. The standards haven't been updated in many years, particularly the family residential standards, which might be 20 years old. And the reason that's a problem is 20 years ago we didn't really detain families. So it's really outdated, inadequate tool, and that was one of the first challenges we struggled with. I'm going to talk today exclusively about family detention, but you should understand I also consult for adult detention, and the adult detention network is distributed widely throughout the entire United States. Family detention right now occurs only at Berks in Pennsylvania, Dilley in Texas, and in the past has been at Carnes in Texas and at Artesia in New Mexico. Currently, Carnes is not holding families, but if you've read the newspaper, probably will reopen for families in the near future. And Artesia is a program that we shut down when we inspected it because of very dangerous care. And I'll elaborate a little bit more about that. Family separation is a pivot point here in the story. And I just want to bring it up and point out that for me, it was a pivot point, because if I didn't have to run away after this talk and we had more time to talk, you might ask, why didn't you more forcefully speak out about your concerns earlier? Well, it's an interesting conversation. I don't know if I've answered that myself, but I want to just tell you, by the time the family separation policy happened, that's when I couldn't sleep, and Pam in Louisiana couldn't sleep, and we reached out to each other and we said, what are we going to do? It led to everything that follows. And we became whistleblowers against the Department of Homeland Security, which is an interesting thing to do, and we'll talk about it. But I want to rewind the tape before we go there. So I started working in detention facilities, as you heard, strictly speaking, when I was 17 years old and worked in refugee camps in Southeast Asia. By the time I finished my medical training and after a few years of working in community health, I took a job in Rhode Island at the Department of Corrections, initially as a frontline physician and eventually in my final years as a medical program director for the state of Rhode Island. And I like to say, when I kind of throw that out there, that I was the state medical program director. Now, that's something to say when you're in Rhode Island, but when you move out to California and the state of Rhode Island fits in, the geographic size of Rhode Island would fit in Joshua Tree National Park. It's much smaller than the county of Riverside, never mind San Bernardino. It was a small system. Nonetheless, I was confronted with one of my first ethical conundrums of being a doctor working in a conflicted setting when there was a videotaped beating of one of my patients, and I was involved in the investigation team because my nurse failed to respond to and tend to the injured man, so I was involved in the investigation. And the investigation quickly turned into a cover-up. And so I found myself in a difficult position as a doctor, saying, am I going to be part of a cover-up of the violation of someone's human rights? So it's interesting because in Rhode Island, after 10/16/2004, when the front page of the newspaper carried an article saying I had quit, I was widely considered in Rhode Island to be a whistleblower, but I was not. I left quietly with a resignation letter to my director. I had spent the past 6 months quietly but firmly objecting to how he was conducting the investigation and not disclosing it to the public. And I finally quietly left. But because they feared that I would be a whistleblower, the director ran to the Providence Journal first, spilled the story, the journal called me for comment. But it's interesting because it's relevant because we can talk, I won't talk a lot about it, but once you get labeled a whistleblower, it has great impact on your career. I could barely get hired the rest of the time I lived in Rhode Island because of my reputation as a troublemaker. So thank goodness we have a lot of other states and people who didn't know me and don't read Rhode Island news. And I got recruited out eventually to California, help co-found the UCR program. But the other thing about this story that's relevant for me is I walked away from that, and life is funny. You know, you don't know what's going to happen. But you'll hear teachers say this, and if you're a student here, I want you to listen to this very clearly. Failure is how you grow. This was a failure for me. I walked out of there and I said, I was trying to protect the patient. I failed to protect the patient. I tried to reform the system. I failed to reform the system. I tried to engage my colleagues. I failed to engage my colleagues. This is a one-day news story, and when it was over, it was over. But it set me on a path saying, boy, if I ever found myself in that position again. So Google was coming online about then, and I said, so I sat down, I love this story. I Googled physician and human rights. And what do you think I found? There's an organization called Physicians for Human Rights. I only didn't put the "for" in my Google search, but up it came. And I contacted them, and wouldn't you know, that's right about when the torture story is breaking. And thus began my journey in thinking about ethics and professionalism and advocacy as a physician. Now, You, as we've already allowed, have a much richer curriculum in professionalism and ethics than most medical schools do, so this should be just review, but that the average person on the street might think of medicine as a profession as really chiefly consisting of technical skills, that you're really smart, you know how to fix people, and that's all there is to it. But you, I think, already understand that there's more to a profession, and particularly it's that ethical code that requires us to behave at a higher level than an average tradesperson, say. And it's all about establishing trust, both between you and an individual patient, but also the trust of the profession with society, that social contract. And elements of that ethical code include civic engagement, protection of human dignity, autonomy of the patient, but I also like to throw in there autonomy of you as a professional, is a related concept, and justice, particularly in health. And again, the familiar medical ethics foundations here, just putting these up so we touch upon them. Not my task here to review them all. I hope almost everyone in this room has at least passing familiarity with these concepts as they relate to the discussion. And then I do like to pull up the American Medical Association Principle of Medical Ethics, largely because many state medical societies use that as sort of the guidebook on how they will interpret medical ethics as it relates to unprofessional conduct. And I like number 3, which doesn't just say shall respect the law, but it's balanced. That respect for the law is balanced with a responsibility to seek changes in those requirements which are contrary to the best interests of the patient. Similarly, their ethical code on torture says not only should doctors not participate in torture, but they have an affirmative duty to try to intervene to prevent or interrupt situations that lead to torture. And that's not simply saying just keep your hands clean. It's saying, no, you have a duty to go further. That's very interesting. All right. First question you might ask is, why was I drawn to work in a prison or detention environment in the first place? Well, you already heard I'd worked in refugee camps, so the idea of trying to deliver health care in confinement settings is one of the issues. And by the way, my recruitment call from a colleague was, when she called me up and there was a job available, she said, how would you like to work in a job where no one on the outside will respect what you do? We pay one of the lowest salaries in the state and you're guaranteed to get sued. And I said, well, that sounds terrific, sign me up. So I went to Brown University Medical School, and I also did my residency training there. And Brown, if you look it up, has a mission statement like all medical schools. It says we're going to be here to deliver health care, particularly to the neediest, and serve the needs of the community. Yet almost every faculty member, when I ended up taking the job at the Department of Corrections, said, why? And I said, I don't know, I thought we were actually sincere about our mission statement. Because the reason I chose to work there is because that's where the patients are. By the way, that's a picture of Willie Sutton. We don't know if he really said it, but the folklore goes, he's the bank robber that when asked, why do you keep robbing banks, his answer was, because that's where the money is. So that's where the patients are. And indeed, you'll find in correctional institutions, that's where the highest level of unmet medical need, and particularly in these days, mental health. We've emptied the state institutions. Disproportionately, people with significant mental illness are rolling through our jails. In fact, jails and prisons are the largest providers, institutional providers of mental health across the United States. So we have a challenge as a profession. This is actual photographs from California prisons. These are boxes that if the security determines the inmate is too much of a risk, when I go there and interview doing audits, they put the inmates in these boxes. I think they're ridiculous, they're unnecessary, but it shows how dehumanizing we've become as a society in these settings. Health professionals in prisons and in detention is related to basic human rights. And for years, I would tell people about the 1976 Supreme Court case which first found that the failure to provide adequate medical care to prisoners is a violation of the 8th Amendment of the Constitution. The 8th Amendment is the ban on cruel and unusual punishment. We now in California have the dubious distinction of being the second Supreme Court, decided by a very conservative Supreme Court a few years ago, saying California's care, combination of overcrowding and failure to provide adequate care, was also a constitutional violation. So that's the intersection of medical care and human rights as interpreted by U.S. law. And then I did mention briefly, and won't elaborate much today, but when I started working with Physicians for Human Rights is when the first reports of abuse of detainees at Guantanamo and also in theater Afghanistan and Iraq were coming out, and we did a lot of investigative work. It's a sad story, it's a discouraging story, because I wanted to see, I was curious, after my experience at the Rhode Island Department of Corrections, what were the doctors doing to protect their patients? It's a very sad story, because not only were they not doing much to protect their patients, they were actively helping design the instruments of torture to be used against their patients. So it's a story I'm happy to come back and tell in another day. It's a sad story, but one that as a society we need to confront, and as a profession we need to confront. So this is all background. And now, so fast forward, I'm working with the Department of Homeland Security, and I'm mostly auditing adult facilities. And they call me up one day and they say, look, this is under the Obama administration. So by the way, I like to set that stage too. There's no question I'm not happy with this administration. I'm not happy what they're doing on this, very much so. But I'm not here to apologize for the Obama administration either. The family detention program started under the Obama administration. And for the same reasons, to try to send a negative message and discourage people to come across the U.S. border. So we were called and they said, we'd like you to go down and inspect this facility in Artesia, New Mexico. This is when I first meet my colleague, Dr. Pamela McPherson. Now I say, I'm an internist, and I say, you know, I could do it, but I'm going to recommend you get a pediatrician, because probably the adult care stuff isn't the big stuff. You want someone to really look at this. But you can imagine how this goes. There's a contracting process, there's a vetting process, and they say, we need you there in a couple weeks. You're just going to have to do the best you can because you're our expert. So my wife's a family practitioner. I know pediatricians. I quickly ask them for quick advice, and I pack my suitcase, off I go. And we go to Artesia, New Mexico, where we found really a disastrous program that was hastily put together by very good people. Point to pause and make here that in all of the bad things I've found along the way, I haven't found, on the ground level, I haven't found people who weren't doing their level best to try to keep these children safe. What I'm going to describe is problems with a policy that makes it nearly impossible for those people to keep people safe, and that's the fundamental flaw that I'll talk about. All right. The fundamental flaw, which we knew as we were getting on our airplanes and flying to Artesia, New Mexico in 2014, the fundamental flaw my colleague and I knew was this, and it comes from decades of literature on refugee health and health and confinement. And what we knew was that institutional detention, I throw an innocent to make a point, but we can simply say children, an exposure, it results in exposure to toxic stress, and the risk of harm is exacerbated by indefinite detention. To put a fine point on this, what the literature tells us is that the very act of detaining children in institutions, which isolates them from a therapeutic community, puts their parents, usually it's stripped down to one parent, they usually go into detention with typically the mother, sometimes the father, in a position of really extreme subordination where the authority figure in their life is being demeaned and taking orders and being ordered around, really has very damaging effects on children. And we know this from a literature that goes back 100 years. So right off the bat, there's the part that the doctors can't fix. It's the conditions of confinement and the very confinement itself, which is damaging. And as we entered the facility, we were sharing our knowledge of the literature as experts with our colleagues, and they were saying, pointing back to that earlier slide, you're here to evaluate, are they meeting the standards that we set? We're really not interested in your opinion about our policy. So there was a restriction placed on us that for the time, we are guilty of having complied with. All right. Now, the next issue that gets raised is, in point of fact, that major problem I've already talked about set aside, there are logistical challenges to actually delivering care. One of the reasons historically we don't confine children is because it's really hard to do right, if not impossible, just for practical matters. First of all, these facilities are often privately run, and private contractors put detention facilities not in downtown LA or downtown Riverside. They put them in very remote locations where real estate is cheap and the labor force is cheap. But what happens when you do that? Good luck recruiting professional staff. Good luck getting children out to a tertiary level hospital quickly or easily. So there's logistical issues created by remote location. That problem is part of the reason why these facilities have struggled to recruit and retain pediatricians. And my wife is a family practitioner. So I don't mean at all to demean family practitioners in saying that when they staff these facilities, they often use family practitioners. But I can tell you, they're often family practitioners who haven't seen pediatric patients in years, because if they come through the Immigration Health Service, they've been working in adult facilities for years. So again, it's this lack of expertise. I would further argue that when we saw the kinds of children coming into these facilities, they should have pediatric specialists. There are misdiagnoses here that probably only a pediatrician would have picked up. And then there's the whole challenge in setting up these programs, particularly when they're collaborations between the U.S. government, multiple agencies of the U.S. government, state agencies, and private contractors, and multiple private contractors. You get into this thing where wherever something goes wrong, everyone goes, it wasn't us, it was them, and sort of untangling that is a mess. So it's a really challenging situation. All right, so what did we find? We went into Artesia, which was built sort of as a lean-to facility on the outside of a federal law enforcement training facility. We found it was manned and staffed up really quickly by uniformed people in the U.S. Public Health Service, really highly professional people who care a lot but met the description that I described, which is people who had mostly only treated adults, exacerbated by the fact that they were rotating in and out on 2-week, 3-week temporary duty assignments from across the country. And what we found is that, again, I asked pediatricians, what am I supposed to look for? And they said, one thing you should look at is what's happening with the children's weights. Now, they use an electronic health record at this particular facility because it was a government-run facility. And in that electronic health record, like probably, well, you use Epic, I use Epic with you at County Hospital, you can pull up a graph of someone's weight. So I made quick work of going through the facility and pulling up every kid. Now, what do you think you'd expect to see from kids who made dangerous crossings from Guatemala, across Mexico, trying to evade authorities, come across the border? What do you think is going to happen when we put them in a U.S.-run facility with ample access to food? What should we see with their weights? I think we'd all expect the weights to either maintain, I would have accepted that, or maybe go up. But what we found in maybe almost a quarter of the population is weights went down. And by the way, that's a side story. It doesn't really amount to unconstitutional level of care or care that would shock the conscience. It just was a result from the fact that the people providing food services that had an attitude, to be quite candid about it, didn't make any effort to provide foods that the children would be familiar with. So they would come into the cafeteria and they'd see these foods they've never seen before and they'd push them away. So that was something that subsequently got corrected in future centers. But in looking at that, what do I stumble upon? I stumble upon a graph. I think, well, this can't be correct. And we all know how to analyze data. If there's one outlier low point and you go, well, but this is one that there are multiple data points. And over a 10-day period, I watch an 18-month child on the chart lose a third of its body weight. Now, pediatricians in the room are people training in pediatrics. What's your general percentage of body weight where you start to get nervous and think maybe we should send you to the emergency room? My pediatrician friends tell me maybe around 10% you're thinking that. Is 33% maybe not compatible with life? Can I reassure you that the child miraculously survived because the mother just so effectively tended to it and breastfed the child as best she could, but got no help after multiple presentations to the otherwise caring and professional healthcare staff, but they weren't looking at their own data on the chart. Multiple providers, no one looking at that graph. And I was able, on a conference call that the top levels of Homeland Security, I'm told Jay Johnson was on the call, where we said, and this is all a confidential system, right? None of this is public at this point. We said, it's a miracle that you in this last week didn't have to call a news conference where a baby died of a treatable disease that a third-year medical student could have diagnosed and treated. You've got real problems here, and we're recommending you shut this place right down. And to the credit of DHS, in that period, within 2 weeks, that facility was shut down, boarded up, and empty. We then went on to inspect the newly opened facilities in Carnes and Dilley. They were significantly better, but they still were not without problems. At Carnes, which was an old adult prison converted into a family detention facility, how they do that? They roll out AstroTurf on the courtyard and put some playground equipment. They paint the heavy metal doors bright primary colors. They do their best to make it look more like a dormitory, but it's still a prison. And why that's relevant here is I also, part of my auditing tool is, if you audit for quality in a place like this, you look, how many people are you sending out to the emergency room, and what are you sending them out for? And in doing that part of the audit, I say, wow, there's a lot of crushed fingers here. What's going on? And when we got to the bottom of that, it was these heavy spring-loaded doors. We said, could you take the springs off maybe as a start? And they say, well, no, because it's hot southern Texas, we'll lose our air conditioning. I go, well, okay, well, you tell me how much the bill would go up and tell me what price you're putting per child finger, because you have a lot of crushed fingers here. Let alone rehanging doors that were not heavy metal or spring-loaded. So they mitigated this, but over a period of not weeks or months, but years, and still have the heavy metal doors, still have some injuries, but have put some technology in place that reduces the risk of them slamming quickly. But it just illustrated that these facilities weren't designed to hold children, and they're not well suited for it. As a comparison, by the way, the other facility in Texas, which is Dilley, was not made out of an old prison, actually had a larger population and no finger injuries. So we were able to say, no, it definitely is your physical facility here that's a problem. The lack of pediatricians would rear its head again in other misdiagnosis. There was a baby who was born while crossing the border, born unattended birth, right from a border holding facility to the Dilley facility, examined by a nurse practitioner only, felt to be fine, normal exam, and at about 8 days of life had a seizure, sent off to the hospital, found to have an intraventricular hemorrhage, probably originating at time of delivery. We don't know, I can't say for sure, but I was pressed to say that maybe a pediatrician might have picked that up earlier, and earlier treatment, of course, of such a significant diagnosis could have been meaningful. And then on our very last visit to these facilities, which was in 2017, interesting part of the story, why not more recently? You've read the newspaper, you'd think they'd have us there all the time. In 2017, the current administration decided they didn't need the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties inspecting family detention anymore. That's changed under public pressure. At the end of this month, I'll be returning to do the first inspection in over 2 years. But in the last, despite many improvements that they made in response to our recommendations, at the very last visit we made to Dilley, we found that because they were so fearful of getting into trouble for not taking violence against children allegations seriously, they were locking up 2- and 3-year-old children who hit another child. And they take the mom and the child and they put them in an isolation unit. That's the first crazy thing I'm here to report. The second thing is they didn't have a space for this, so they used the medical unit. So now they use the medical unit as a punitive unit, and they were punishing 2- and 3-year-old children. As my colleague, who's a child and adolescent psychiatrist, explained to them, holding her rage back, that the recommendation on timeout for a toddler is 1 minute per year of age. They were being held for 3, 4, 5 days while an investigation went on, but not allowed to leave, so no longer doing programming, no longer getting out, but being kept in this medical room. And it just showed, no one wanted to harm these children. You get that? When I go there, no one wanted them to suffer, but they didn't know what they were doing. And when you confine children and you institutionalize them, you create all sorts of problems for yourself that actually the best of people don't really know how to untangle. There's so many reasons we don't detain children. These are just some of them. All right, so what do we do about this? At this stage, what we have done is we've made 10 inspections to 4 family detention sites, 4 of those, Carnes and Dilley, we went back to 4 times. And we're writing reports that go up our chain of command. Cameron Quinn is the current political appointee, head of CRCL. Our reports go through them, they get channeled up through the bureaucracy, they get fed back to these institutions, and slowly improvements are made. But this is an internal process. We are contractors who have signed documents saying that this is an internal process and we will not disclose any of our knowledge. But then last summer, we turn on the news and we see they're tearing kids from their mothers. And we're shocked, as everyone is. And so I reach out to Pam, who I kind of expected I'd never see again. The key part of the story I've skipped over is as we left our last inspection in 2017, they said, you probably won't need to inspect family detention because Homeland Security recognizes this is a failed experiment, and they'll be phasing them out. So I said goodbye to Pam and thought I'd never see her again. My joke with her now is we'll both be mentioned in each other's obituaries now, so there's no escaping. You know, we're joined together. So, but we were doing these internal reporting. Now, when the family separation story comes out, and I literally, you know, if you have any connection to this, you're not sleeping. I mean, I'm tossing. I can sleep anywhere, but I'm tossing and turning. And I call her up and I say, hey, Pam, it's me. Is this bothering you like it's bothering me? And she said, I can't sleep. And then we said, what can we do? And the first thing we said is the separation of children is occurring at border facilities, that strictly speaking, and then they're being housed in another branch of government, HHS and the Office of Refugee. That's outside of DHS, Department of Homeland Security. So he said, strictly speaking, this isn't our area. And so we said, well, I guess there's not much we can do. I went back to, and I said, well, there's not much we can do. I went back to sleep. I couldn't sleep for the next 2 nights. I called her back and I go, okay, there's not much we can do, but here's what I'm thinking. Number one, that shouldn't matter. We should do something. But number two, I'm thinking if there's public, and there already was, the public reacted very quickly to this story. If there's public pressure that's saying you can't do this, what are they going to do next? They're going to rapidly expand family detention. And of course, that's exactly what happened. So now we have a little bit of a jump because we're anticipating this. And so we write very strongly worded letters to Cameron Quinn and the Office of the Inspector General. And now we don't stay within the guardrails. We are quite explicit that the detention of children is harmful to their health and we can no longer sort of be a part of it, and we object to it. And we waited. And needless to say, Office of Inspector General, to this day, this is over a year later, has not acknowledged receipt of our complaint, although Congress has certainly queried the Acting Director of Homeland Security and the Acting Inspector General about what they're doing about our complaint. And Cameron Quinn wrote a nice little letter back saying, thank you for your concerns. As you told me, you referred it to the Office of Inspector General, so as it's under an active investigation, I can't comment about it. So that's a year ago, and we've heard nothing from them since, and there's been no inspections of family detention. So here's where we have that crisis of conscience. What do we do now? And that's where my connections with physicians of human rights, others in the community, came in handy, and I confidentially called a few friends, and I said, who do you know, can you recommend a good lawyer? So there happens to be in Washington, D.C., a nonprofit organization, legal organization called the Government Accountability Project. I reached out to them and asked them if they would be able to help guide us through this, because we weren't intending to sacrifice ourselves for a cause if we could find a way to do it legally and ethically. And that's what they helped us do. And really, it's a practical part of my talk. If you ever find yourself in one of these ethically difficult situations, do get good legal advice, because you may decide to do something that's outside the bounds of the law, but you want to know what the consequences are, and you want to get good advice. Weren't we relieved? And I did not know this until I talked to them and they heard our story and they said, well, what is your concern? That what we wanted to disclose, which we felt was an imminent threat of harm, foreseeable threat of harm to children, required us as physicians, as health professionals, to sound the alarm. And they said, lucky for you, that specific task is protected in whistleblower law, in federal whistleblower law. So you might have heard in recent weeks, because the whistleblower discussion is very much front page, that there's a Whistleblower Protection Act, and that's really for government employees, but there is parallel legislation for contractors. So we didn't know this until we talked to them. So we were protected by similar. So through them, we wrote to a Whistleblower Protection Caucus, which is a bipartisan group of legislators led by a Republican, Chuck Grassley, who is a fierce protector of whistleblowers. You noticed this last week. Despite the partisan nature of the discussion in the past week, Chuck Grassley has come to the fore and said whistleblowers deserve protection, and this whistleblower acted within the law. So good for him for doing the right thing there. So we reported to their caucus. And then that's the point, and the lawyers warned us of this. You can do the first step and then buckle your seatbelt, because you will determine nothing that follows, and that's largely been true from my last year of my life. Just a little moment. I started to do this, but it's important to say that a whistleblower is not anyone who just disagrees with their company or their government. You can look this up to read more about it, but there's a fairly specific definition. In the government sense, it's a violation that you're reporting, a violation of law, rule or regulation, gross mismanagement, gross waste of funds, abuse of authority. Now Pam and I were most focused as professionals. This is a substantial and specific danger to public health or safety. So we were covered under that. My lawyers happened to share with me, they say, when we described what we knew, they said, you actually qualify under every one of those other, if we ever had to go to court, we would defend you under every single one of those because we think the program, as you've described it, violates all of those rules. But nonetheless, so that understand that whistleblower is not that you just disagree with the policy. That wouldn't get you there. And about anything, you have to meet sort of one of these criteria. And a lawyer would help you sort that out. All right, so I've already told you, I've been a bit of an advocate. I've been in the middle of controversy. I reported on the U.S. torture program in real time and had to take some tough media hits back in the day. I've done this before. God bless Pam McPherson, who is a child and adolescent psychiatrist who takes care of kids all day and has never done anything like this before. And after we sent our letter into the Whistleblower Caucus, she calls me up and she goes, what do we do now? And I say, well, usually we wait and see what happens. And she goes, didn't you look at the New York Times? And I said, this is literally an hour or two after we sent it. This is on the New York Times because one of the members of the caucus passed it right along to the New York Times. So within an hour of us making this decision, an hour or two, it's a public decision and we had to deal with consequences. Now, we went through a period where we waited for Congress to do the right thing, and we did have a series of in-person and telephonic debriefings with staffers and Congress people, but nothing really happened. Months went by. Very important part of the story that I don't want to skip over. I got good legal advice. I pat myself on the back for being smart enough to do that. But the other thing I did that I'd learned from that previous episode in Rhode Island, a colleague of mine said, why didn't you reach out to professional medical societies to back you up? So before I became a whistleblower, Pam and I became a whistleblower, I said, Pam, call the American Psychiatric Association and don't settle for anyone short of a senior officer in responding to your call. I did the same for the American College of Physicians and the AMA. I'm going to be a little hard on the AMA. The AMA really never responded, but the ACP and the APA, psychiatry, responded to us at the level of the presidents and their key Washington people. And we said, we can't, obviously, cart before the horse, we can't tell you what we're going to reveal before we reveal it, but if we represent to you that we think we're acting consistent with your own ethics manual and doing what we have to do, we hope you would consider lending us your support publicly when the disclosure is made. I'm very proud of the ACP that within a day of our disclosure sitting in the New York Times came out with a letter specifically embracing what we had done and going further and saying we had an obligation as professionals to do what we did. Really powerful letter that will mean everything to me for the rest of my career. Now, was there something about the fact that we're on the desktop again that I'm not... We've got a pop-up about joining a network. That's above my skill set. And then within about a week, we didn't even ask for this, but the ACP and the American Psychiatric Association reached out to the other associations, and they wrote Congress, 14 of them, including the AMA, also backing us up, saying that these doctors did the right thing, what are you going to do about it? So this is important, just as a strategic matter of getting through these things. Leveraging the moral authority of the profession was a very important thing to do for a variety of reasons, not the least of which did I tell you that under this administration, with this level of disclosure, and we're not even done with that story yet, that when they did not end our contract, which they certainly under other circumstances could have done for any reason or no reason, but they didn't. But when my contract expired, they invited me to resubmit an RFP, and I was just awarded a 5-year extension on my contract. I believe it's not because of the lawyers so much, although it's definitely because of them. The DHS knows they could be sued for retaliation. But I think it's the fact that they recognized that it wasn't just us, but organized medicine was standing behind us, and it was just a fight they didn't want to pick. That's my own theory, that's my own thought. But it meant a lot to me that we got that backing, and there's from from the letter. And then this led to a variety of advocacy groups using our work in campaigns. Our work has been cited in litigation related to the Flores legislation. For those of you who followed the story, Flores is the governing a court agreement, a consent decree that says children cannot be held for more than 20 days and are entitled to certain protections that this government has not provided. So the work has been used quite a bit. Come fall, everything quieted down. We had talked to Congress quietly behind closed doors and nothing happened. So when 60 Minutes came knocking on our door through our attorneys, we were hesitant to do media, but our attorneys said, you know, it's good that you're a whistleblower, but what good is being a whistleblower if no one heard the whistle blow? And there was that New York Times story, and Congress heard it, but the public really didn't get the story. And so we did agree to sit down and go on 60 Minutes, which is one of those things that someone said, oh, now you have that off your bucket list. And I said, no, I never had 60 Minutes on my Again, you wait a little time. Washington Post invited us to submit an op-ed. Sadly, the occasion was the first child death in U.S. custody. And we were able to say, hey, 4 years ago, we warned Jay Johnson directly that if you want to stay in this game, we predict you're going to lose a child. And by now, those of you who follow the story, depending on how you count, we're up to 4 or 5 children lost in U.S. custody, probably most of them from things that could have been diagnosed and treated if you had a functioning system. So confining children has a real cost, including death. I, since then, have been invited. The most high-profile thing that I was invited to do is I returned to the border with 3 U.S. senators and one of our California representatives to brief them on what's going on there. So it's not like there was no uptake. And here's actually Senator Merkley. I don't know, who knows social media? Is that Instagram? Is it Snapchatagram? I don't know. But anyway, there he is in the van. And then, but what's happened since, you know, when I go to Washington and advocacy groups, or we get awards, as we have by people who care about this kind of thing, and it all seems very nice. But I say, why are you giving us awards when we totally failed to protect the children we tried to protect? I don't think anyone deserves an award right now. What we need is people to turn attention to the fact that despite all of this advocacy, U.S. policy continues to move in the wrong direction, and that we continue to detain greater numbers of children. That separate and related part is what started to unfold, of course, this summer, which is that there was a backup because family detention didn't have the capacity, and people started to back up at the border, and you know the news reports and how terrible things were there. So things are really continuing to go the wrong direction, overcrowding, bad outcomes. You know, this is actually, I just pulled this for this talk. This is a letter where ethicists confronted the government, saying that this is just unethical what we're doing as a matter of public policy. What I want to close with is to remind you that regardless of where you stand politically, partisan-wise, on everything else, that what I tell people, the most important thing I have to report back to you on my time going into these facilities, that really touches back to my time as a 17-year-old in refugee camps in Southeast Asia. I will say the same thing now at age 57 that I said at 17 when I talk to people and people say, what's it like? Here is what it is like. These are people. These are young, vulnerable children who are very fragile, who come to us already traumatized, already in poor health. If I don't care who you voted for in the last election, if I took you and placed you next to these families and you had to look them in the eye, you would probably come away from that conversation saying, do we really need to do this? That's really the main thing. These are strollers lined up in a detention facility. These are mothers and young children walking around in prison-like facilities. You can paint it all primary care and put little classrooms in that look like any other classroom, but don't forget, everyone knows and everyone is living in a confined facility, isolated from community, fearing what happens next. There's this element of indefinite detention and fear of the future that creates great levels of anxiety among the parents that is passed along to the children and can result in lifelong damage. Now there's a paper, you always should reference a paper, little disclosure, I was a consultant for this paper and these are colleagues of mine, but they wrote a paper that just came out in JAMA on August 30th that asks the questions, can physicians work in U.S. detention facilities while upholding their oath? I encourage you to pull the article and read it. They come up with a number of ways the system could be improved But they also, I was pleased to say, sort of come down on a position where, yes, you don't want to abandon patients in need, but if you go in there like I do, you should do what I've tried to do, which is go in there, but don't stay silent while the human rights of your patients or your proxy patients are being violated. So that's a practical paper that sort of tries to thread through the ethical challenges and come up with a possible solution. I leave you more with a question, now what? I mean, I've gone as far as I can with my colleague Pam and other people who have come along for the ride as an individual and partnered with some really amazing people. But I put it to you as members of the profession. What is American medicine as a profession doing? American medicine, through its professional organizations, has been very clear to the government that this policy is deeply damaging and harming children in real time. That professional recommendation is entirely dismissed. Now, I put it to you this way, and I put it to the AMA the same way. If the AMA put out a statement saying the proposal by Congress to reduce physician reimbursement by 10% is unacceptable to us, and Congress ignored you, we would say, well, check our website. We have a statement about that. No, they're in the hallways of Congress every day of the week lobbying member by member to get those reimbursement rates changed. Why don't we devote the same energy as a profession into getting inhumane and cruel policy changed? That's my challenge. I hope some of you will join us in trying to uphold our obligation as a profession to society. I'll end my comments there. There's very little time for questions, but we can take them until someone rings the bell. And I thank you. Perfect. Thank you.
Well, let's thank We do have just a couple of minutes for a couple of questions. If there are any comments or questions from you. Yes, right here.
My question would be, have you, or could you, or could anyone else give a recommendation of what these facilities ideally, how they should run, what they should provide for the families, given the political climate, the problems with immigration and homeland security and terrorism, which is, you know, I haven't seen on the news Latin American or Latin descent terrorist story, but it's always tied to them. Like, has there been a recommendation of what this should be?
So my own answer is that the issue of controlling immigration and maintaining security are certainly legitimate issues, and you might notice I've been neutral on that topic per se. I have my own opinion, and on another day we can talk about it, but it's irrelevant here. That my objection to what we're doing is we've taken a very complicated problem that has multiple levers that could be pulled and manipulated to both increase security, better address the needs of these people before they undertake these perilous journeys that involve things like foreign aid, development, and support for people in country. You know, some of this is being looked at and done, but not robustly. My problem with the current policy is it took a very simplified approach, took a very blunt instrument that uses children to send a political message that traumatizes children. It's a very unsophisticated and unacceptable response to the otherwise legitimate concerns of how do you maintain security and have a process. Time doesn't permit, but by the way, if you've read news reports that people come into the story, into the country, and they never go to their hearings, that's not true with families with small children. The show rate across the board is about 85%, but if you give them an attorney, it's 98%. If you give them an attorney who explains the process, 98%. Having said that, with our tough asylum rules now, 4 out of 5 will be returned to their country. So you can have, I don't think we should have such a restrictive immigration program, but if you do, you still don't have to confine children. Children will show up, you can house them in the community. So this is unnecessary. This is I'm going to be honest, I think it's about being mean-spirited and trying to look like we're being mean-spirited to send a message. By the way, that doesn't seem to particularly work. If you're fleeing violence and you think you're going to be killed in Guatemala, you'll say, I'll roll the dice on this system. So it doesn't seem to work, nor is it ethical.
I see Dr. Balliard.
How is the Remain in Mexico policy going to impact? I mean, this is a very difficult issue to deal with
Yes.
here at home now as detention centers are being built across the border. Things are being shifted over there.
Well, to me, it's sort of an out of sight, out of mind kind of issue, so that I think if we've had trouble with pouring a ton of money, go look at the budget numbers of what we're paying per resident, per night, per bed in these family detention facilities. It's an astronomical amount of money. Do you think that's what Mexico's going to pour into their detention centers? Do they have the same kind of expertise and resources that we do here? So, you can't say that because now it's on the Mexico side, it has nothing to do with us. No, it's on the Mexico side because we really sort of coerced Mexico into that position. So you don't get to wash your hands any more than the U.S., who has a robust foreign policy in Central America that contributed the governments and so forth that led to whatever's in climate change, all of this. We do live in a global community. Loma completely understands that. What we do does have impact. So you don't get to sort of push them the other side of the border and go, morally, we're excused now. Everything we do has consequences. So I'm worried about that. If it was bad here, I worry it'll be worse there.
Maybe one more, yes.
Well, it's a great question, but it goes back to the question I've been asking: where is the AMA on this? They will say, if we confronted the leadership in the room today, that they have a couple strong statements over the last 4 or 5 years saying they do not support family detention and think it should be changed, and they co-signed that letter. But back to my point, why haven't they reached out to their colleagues in Mexico? I mean, to do that right, you'd want a professional society to professional society, top level interaction. So, I'm not done with that. I was invited to speak, give the same talk I gave here today at the AMA in San Diego next month, and I hope to press them on this a little further. California Medical Association, you should know, did invite me to speak. A year ago, there was a subset of the room that came up and followed me around but after months, they drifted away. California Medical Association did pass a resolution that got passed. This sort of said we should stop doing this and we should lobby harder. It got passed up to AMA National and died there. So, any of these fights, if anyone's participated in social justice struggles, I'm not expecting things to happen like that, but I would like to see more people stand up to the plate. It is I'm a student of history. History will judge us, and not in 50 years, in 10 years. A lot of us will still be alive when history looks back on this period and our children and grandchildren will say, hey, what were you doing then? What did you do about this?
Maybe an appropriate note to end on. Would we again join together in thanking Dr. Allen?
Thank you.
Glad to have you back.